Hello everyone. Before going to the topic, first of all, I will just show you the question pattern that comes in ISC Biology. Paper 1, that is theory, it is of 70 marks. This paper has been divided into two parts. Paper 1, part 1 and part 2. Part 1, which is of 20 marks. There are altogether 20 questions of 1 mark each. Sometimes in this 20 question, it may be divided into several subgroups. Sometimes differentiate the following. Basically, objective type of question may come in your part 1. Sometimes contribution of the scientist, choose the correct option, write the function of the following, which will cover up the entire part of the syllabus. Objective question which will cover up the entire part of the syllabus. That will be of 1 marks each. Part 2, which is of 50 marks, is divided into section A, section B and section C. In section A, there will be altogether 7 questions of 2 marks each, which covers of 14 marks. That means there are altogether 7 questions and each question will be of 2 marks each. Section B, here also altogether 7 questions. This will be of 3 marks each. That means altogether 21 marks. And section C, that is 3 questions of 5 marks each. Altogether, that means 15 marks. 3 questions of 5 marks each, that will be in section C. So, when we add all these things, from part 1, 20, section A, 14, 21, 15, it is 70 marks. So, this is the question pattern. Now, in the previous class, we have discussed about asexual reproduction, the different types of asexual reproduction. Today, we will be discussing on vegetative propagation in plant. Now, what do you mean by vegetative propagation? First of all, propagation means any part of the plant that you increase its number, you call it as propagation. But first of all, you need to understand what do you mean by vegetative. Now, vegetative means the part of the plant, okay, which can be used for reproducing, that means it's producing of its own kind, like the root, stem, leaves, the inflorescence. These parts of the plant can be used for propagating. That means we get the offspring from this part. Getting offspring from this part of the plant, you call it as vegetative propagation. For instance, you see the leaf, the root, okay? There are certain plants whose a part of the root, when it is left in the soil, from here, adventitious roots may come up and then a bud may emerge leading into a new plant. Again, part of the plant, that is stem, okay? Here root, stem, even the leaves, okay? There are certain plants whose leaf also, if you just put it in the soil, from here also adventitious root may come out and then this grows into a new individual plant. That means the root, stem, leaves and certain parts of inflorescence also can be used for propagating the plant. That means we can get the offspring from this plant. You call it as vegetative propagation in plant. Now, according to the syllabus, first of all, we have by subaerial stem. What do you mean by subaerial stem? You see that this is fully aerial. Okay, the part of the plant that lies in the atmosphere, that is aerial. But when I say by subaerial, that means this part of the stem Okay, suppose say this is the land or the soil. The part of the stem may lie either on the surface of the land, or either it may lie just below the soil, superficially placed. Then you call it as subaerial stem. Some part is in the air, some part is in the attached with the ground or in the ground. You call it as subaerial stem. So in them, first of all, according to your syllabus, we will be learning one is a type of subaerial stem, that is by runner. Now, how do you know that it is a runner? Okay, first of all, the write-up. The subaerial stem grows along the surface of soil. So in this case, the subaerial stem grows along the surface of the soil. Suppose say this is the land. Okay, here the stem grows along the surface of the soil. Then after that, its node bears scale. That means you see that here you have the node, here you have the node. This is the node. Okay, this is the node. This one is internode. Okay, nodes bear scale leaves with axillary bud. So here in the node you will find the axillary bud. From the node what will happen? Adventitious root. So when I say adventitious root, what do you mean by adventitious root? The root that gets emerged or developed from the non-rooting parts. Okay, from the non-rooting parts you call it as adventitious root. Like from the stem, from the leaves, from the part of the plant. When the root is emerging from the non-rooting parts, you use the term called as adventitious root. So here the root is emerging from the node. Nodes bear scale leaves with axillary bud. So here from the node, an axillary bud emerges out. The bud give rise to adventitious root downward. The adventitious root grow downward. Always the root grow downward into the soil. And shoot upward, that means this axillary bud will get converted into a shoot. Upward, hence new plant arise from the node, and such plants are called as runners. That means you see that as long as the length, this stem, subaerial stem is running along the surface of the soil, okay, surface of the soil. So when it is running along the surface of the soil, wherever the node is there, from the node adventitious root come out, axillary bud emerges out, it gets converted into a shoot. Afterwards, what will happen? This runner may decay also, okay, and this give rise to a individual plant. So this type of vegetative propagation, you call it as runners. Now, where do you often observe this? Then you observe in a plant, okay, lawn grass. In lawn grass, that is Cynodon dactylon. Cynodon dactylon. So when I say Cynodon dactylon, that is doob grass, okay, lawn grass. You observe this. Now another one, another type is subaerial stem, and the another type is by suckers. Okay, so what do you mean by sucker? A sucker arises close to the ground, travel underground for short distance, and comes out to give rise to a new plant. So in this case, what do you see? You see this is the surface of the soil. Here you will find the root grows underneath. That means along the surface, okay, just below to the surface of the soil. So here a sucker arises close to the ground. It is not much deep. It is just very much near to the surface of the soil. A sucker arises close to the ground, travel underground, okay, for short distance, and comes out to give rise to a new plant. That means from here, again, from the node, it gives rise to new plant. That means the root is growing underneath, from wherever the nodes are there, from there it comes out, it pops out to give rise to a new plant. So this is the difference between, when the difference between runner and sucker is coming. Grows along the surface, close, a sucker arises close to the ground, travels underground for a short distance. The upper one, the runner, is above, and the sucker is just below the soil surface, and it just grows for a short distance. Example, where do you often observe this? Then in Mentha arvensis. Okay, so this one is sucker. And in which plant do you observe? Mentha arvensis. That means when I say Mentha arvensis, I am talking about mint plant. Okay, Pudina, mint plant. Another one, the third category of by subaerial stem, you have by offset. Okay, and offset is a short and thick runner. Again, when I say runner, that means you see, that means it should go on the surface. So surface can be either water, it can be either soil or whatever the medium is there. And offset is a short and thick runner like subaerial stem which grows in all directions. So here you here in this case you see, suppose this is the medium, suppose it can be the water, it can be the soil, whatever categories. Okay, so here the stem is there, subaerial stem is there, but what is happening? This is growing haphazardly here and there, in all the direction it is growing, and from here you will find the shoots emerging out, from each of the subaerial stem. That means the subaerial, from the subaerial stem, you will find the birds emerging out in all the direction. And offset is a short, it is a short one, not so long one, short, thick, very much thick, runner like a runner only. Okay, it grows on the surface. Aerial stem which grows in all direction. Here you see it is growing in all direction, and from all the direction you will find that what comes out? The bird comes out and it gets formed into a new plant. Where often you observe this? You observe in a plant that is called as Echonoria. Okay, Echonoria, that is water hyacinth. Okay, water hyacinth. So this is a aquatic plant and it is also called the terror of Bengal. This plant is also called the terror of Bengal. Why it is called the terror of Bengal? Because it spreads very quickly. Okay, for this reason water hyacinth is also called the terror of Bengal. Now come to the next part, that is vegetative propagation by underground stem. Now stem, you see, when we talk about a stem, then we see that the part of the plant that lies above the ground, this one is the stem. Okay, this is the stem. So here you see, here you have the node, here you have the node, in between this you have the internode. Okay, you have the, in between the node you have the internode. Now from this node you see the bud emerges out, you call it as axillary bud. Okay, so this is the stem. But here when it is vegetative propagation by underground stem, that means first of all we will take our stem tuber, that means potato. Okay, potato, when I take a plant Solanum tuberosum. Okay, Solanum tuberosum, that means we are talking about potato. Since you all are in class 12, it's better if you can write the botanical name, scientific name. I think it will maintain the standard, but there is no hard and fast rule, but it's better to write. Okay, Solanum tuberosum, that is I am talking about potato. So this potato is a underground modified stem. Why? Because you see, you will find like this type of structure. Okay, crescent shape, half moon shape structure. This one you call it as eye. Again, at some interval you will find it like this type of structure. Okay, and when the potato is remaining for a longer period of time, you will find small bird coming out. Okay, you call it as axillary bird. Okay, this card like mark that you see, you call it as scales. Okay, now these are the juncture, these are the point, you call it as node. Okay, in between in between this node. What do you call it? Internode. Now you see the features. You see the above aerial stem and this stem. What do you find? You find here the node, axillary bud, internode. Having the same morphological structure. I am not going to the histological part. Okay. This type of underground modified stem, you see, having all these morphological features, they are called as underground modified stem. Now, what is the work? Here you see that most of the food prepared by the plant are stored in this underground modified stem. But at the same time, what also it can be done? It can be used for vegetative propagation. That means a part of it when it is cut, okay, a part of it when it is cut, splitted from the bud, you remove it, you may get number of plant. All this part when you germinate into a soil, then from here you can get a new offspring. You can increase the number of this plant. Okay. For this reason, it can be used for vegetative propagation. So vegetative propagation by underground stem, first one is what? Stem tuber. Let's go for the nodes out here. Stem tuber, there are underground storage organ. What do they store? They store food in the form of a starch. Swollen, you see it is swollen up with stored food. They are produced at the tip of the ground, underground stems. Okay, so root is here. At the tip of it, it is formed. Underground stem. They possesses axillary bud. Right now I showed you. And its axils. Okay, these are all the axils. Scale leaves. Okay, scales, scale leaves. You can call it as scale leaves because from here only axillary bud emerge. Present on the nodes. Okay, so here from the nodes also what is coming? Axillary. In the aerial part also axillary bud are emerging. Present on the node which are known as, there are also referred as eye. Okay, each bud may grow into a new plant in the next growing season. In the next growing season, again from this bud, axillary bud, a new shoot may emerge out. Farmer, what do they do? If these shoots are big enough, they cut this part and then put it into a soil, which can be from here you get a new plant. So this type of vegetative propagation through the stem tuber, through this underground stem, you call it as stem tuber. Another one is rhizome. So any swollen horizontal part, okay, like this. Okay, Gingiber officinale. I am talking about ginger. Okay, so these are horizontal. They grow horizontally. Okay, they grow horizontally. They do not grow vertically. So these are horizontally growing underground stem which bear. They also have a scale. Okay, this like this type of scales are present. Okay, they have a scale, leaves, and at the tip you will find like this type of buds emerging out. When the rhizome, when this rhizome is old enough, you will find the bud emerging out. And adventitious root, from each of this node you will find adventitious root. So again, when I say adventitious root, the root emerges from the other than the rooting parts, you call it as adventitious root. So adventitious root, and what do they have? They have a stored food. Okay, this aerial shoot form independent plants when part of the rhizome separate by natural decay. That means when this bud emerges out, this part may decay and then it grows into a new independent individual plant. Okay, this may grow into a new individual plant. If this part of it decays, from here the shoot emerges out, this will grow into a new individual plant. Okay, when parts of rhizome separate by natural decay, that means this whole body, okay, the stored foods gets decayed. By the time whatever the food is there, that is being used by the bud in order to produce a shoot. So very often do you observe? You observe in ginger plant. Okay, so in ginger the type of propagation that is done, increase, you are increasing its number, it is by rhizome. Okay, now another one, that is bulb. Okay, so bulb are what? Like take for example onion. Okay, so this is the stem This is the adventitious root. Adventitious root. Okay. Here you will find the terminal bud. This, the dry part of the leaves, you call it as scale leaves, and the fleshy part of it, you call it as fleshy leaves. So here you see that according to the notes, these are condensed underground shoot. The shoot has been condensed. Okay, the shoot has been condensed. Each bulb has a very short disc. Okay, like stem. This disc, this structure that you see out here is a stem. Disc-like structure is a stem, and fleshy. Each part of the leaf is very fleshy in nature. Okay, and more or less, whenever you cut onion, you get a very your eyes gets watered up. It contains allyl disulfide, sulfur compound are present. Due to that, your eye burn. That means these chemicals are present in these fleshy leaves. Between the leaves, one or more terminal bud. This is the middle one is the terminal bud. Okay, leaves are modified and terminal bud which grow into a new shoot. This terminal bud only grow into a new shoot. And finally, these scale leaves, fleshy leaves and all, what do? They decay, giving rise to a new plant. So, this is the vegetative propagation by underground stem. In your syllabus, you also have bulbils. Okay, so bulbils, from where they are formed? Bulbils are formed from the inflorescence part. So, in a plant like agave and all, from the axillary bud of the inflorescence of this plant, the mother plant dies off, and from the axillary bud, a new shoot emerges out, and you use the term called as bulbils. Okay, B-U-L-B-I-L-S. Okay, I have not made a slide of that. So anyway, you have also bulbils in your syllabus. Now, let's come to the next part, that is sexual reproduction. Now, we have already finished asexual reproduction, vegetative reproduction. Now come to the next part, that is sexual reproduction. What do you mean by sexual reproduction? So definition: sexual reproduction involves formation and fusion. First of all, formation, that means it has to form a reproductive cell, and then after forming a reproductive cell, and fusion of haploid male and female gamete. That means the haploid gamete of male, haploid gamete of female has to fuse together. These gametes fuse to form the diploid zygote. After that, when this haploid gamete, when they fuse together, what gets formed? Diploid zygote gets formed. And that zygote undergoes mitotic division. There are number of processes, there are number of events. After that, it leads to the formation of new organism. This is called as what? Sexual reproduction. Now, what are the basic features of this sexual reproduction? Okay, so first of all, in a sexual reproduction, what are the components is required? Okay, what are the criteria required? What are the characteristic features? In any way, the question can be asked. So, first of all, what do you have? You have two parents. That means there must be two parents. It involves two parents, so it is termed as biparental. Sexual reproduction is biparental. Sometimes give reason type of question may come. Why sexual reproduction is often called as biparental? Then your give the reason type of in that answering how you should answer, because it involves two parents. And when I say two parents, haploid gamete coming from the male, haploid gamete coming from the female. When they fuse together, it leads to the formation of zygote. Okay, biparental. Number two is that what? Haploid gamete. It involves formation and fusion of male and female gamete. That means here the formation of the haploid gamete has to take place in the male, formation of haploid gamete in the female has to take place. After they have produced the haploid gamete, there must be way and means to make this haploid gamete fuse together. Number three, meiosis. That means in sexual reproduction, what is also involved? Meiosis is involved. That means it involves meiosis. When I say meiosis, you have been hearing haploid gamete. The haploid gamete is due to meiotic division. In meiotic division, the chromosome number, okay, the diploid cell, the germinal epithelium, okay, the any type of reproductive gametes, when they are diploid in nature, first of all, they have to get reduced to half. When they get reduced to half, the process of getting reduced to half, you call it as meiotic division. So when do this happen? This happened during what? Gamete formation. So gamete formation, that means when the reproductive cells are getting formed, you call it as gamete formation. And mitosis during development of offspring from zygote. After the zygote has got formed, the repeatedly the cells divides into number of cells, from 1 cell to 2 cell, 4 cell, 6 cell, 8 cell, 16 cell, 32 cell stage. Then in this way, the cell keeps on dividing depending upon the type of organism. So here, when the cells are dividing in number, you call it as mitotic division. So in sexual reproduction, what one characteristic feature is there? Meiosis has to go on. Number 4, variation. Offsprings are genetically different from parent and from each other because of recombination of gene from two parents. Here you see that in class 10, in class 11, you have learned about the cell, the mitosis, the meiosis, and then in meiotic, okay, in the you see that in the meiotic prophase 1 division. Okay, what you had? You had leptotin, zygotin, paciotin, diplotin, dikinesis, and then after that again meiotic 2 division starts. So in that you see that there is a crossing over. During that crossing over, what takes place? The genetical constitution, the genetical information are exchanged, and due to that it brings the variation in all the 4 reproductive cells depending upon the type of organism. So here all the 4 cells are different from their parent because the genetical constitution remains totally different. This difference in the reproductive cells only creates a variation in the living organism. So these are the 4 basic features of sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, okay, in sexual reproduction, what are the phases of life cycle? That means when an organism is born till its death, what are the different phases it comes during its lifespan? Okay, so in the first slide we have already discussed about what is lifespan. So like that, in a sexually reproducing organism, okay, what are the phases of life cycle? Then number 1 is juvenile or vegetative phase. So here it is the period from the birth till the attainment of sexual maturity. An individual is born, okay. After that, what will happen? By the time the plant is if it is a plant, the plant should be able to produce a pollen grain. A plant today, you see that you sow the seed, germinates, the other day it's not going to produce pollen grain, it is not going to bear flowers at all. A certain time is required. So by the time the plant produces pollen grain, produces flower, you use the term called as what? Vegetative phase. And if it is in the animal, if it is in the human being, then you see that by the time the organs become active, the organ starts producing these reproductive cells, okay, the gamete formation takes place, gametogenesis, which includes spermatogenesis and oogenesis. When this reproductive organ becomes active, by the time you use the term called as juvenile or vegetative phase. So it is the period from the birth till the attainment of sexual maturity. By the time the reproductive organ becomes functional in nature, you use the term called as juvenile or vegetative phase. Number 2 is reproductive phase. During this phase, after crossing the juvenile or vegetative phase, the reproductive organ becomes functional in nature. If it is a plant, then you see that what do? They start producing pollen grain. Okay, in the gynoecium there are certain types of physiochemical event going on. Okay, the stigma becomes sticky in nature. Similarly, you see that in the cases of human being also, what will happen? The secondary sexual character gets developed. So when the secondary sexual character, there is some type of biochemical changes going in the body. So when during this time, what do you call it? You call it as reproductive phase. So gametogenesis, formation of gamete, reproductive cells, formation you call it as gametogenesis, and production of offspring. During this time only an individual is able to produce the offspring. If it is a plant, they are able to produce fruits and seeds. If it is a human being, then they are able to produce the young ones. It is during that time of giving a birth to a new individual, you use the term called as reproductive phase. Then comes the third one, that is called as senescence and aging. Okay, senescence and aging. Phase is characterized by gradual deterioration of vital capacity. That means you see that an individual in which the physiochemical part of the body, okay, each and every hormonal regulation, enzymes regulation, each and every body activity slows down. This slowing down is referred as senescence. In the reproductive phase, you see that the spermatogenesis are going on, but in the senescence, what will happen? This process is going on, but it slows down. The slowing down of any physiochemical event going in any organism, whether it is plant or animal. Okay, if it is a plant, say for example, the production of fruits, flowers, seeds is slowing down. That is senescence. Similarly, in the cases of human being, each and every activity of the body slows down. That is called as senescence. And finally, when there is a complete stoppage of all this production, all the physiochemical event finally comes to a stop, you use the term called as aging. Stepping into, that means the last phase of the senescence, you call it as aging. So phase is characterized by gradual deterioration of vital capacity and ends and stepping towards the death, you call it as aging. And finally, when the last part, that is the number 4 part, I have missed out, here you can write death. So death means completely stoppage. That means when the total vital capacity of the living organism totally stops, okay, all the biochemical event totally stops, then it leads to death of a living organism. So this way, into 4 phases, the life cycle of a sexually reproducing organism has been categorized. Okay, now let's come to the another part of the topic, that is unusual flowering phenomenon in some plant. So what is this unusual flowering? You will find that if it is a plant, all plants may not flower, but there are certain types of plants which may flower at a certain interval of time, at a certain years. Okay, now take for example, one example is bamboo, Bambusa tulda, okay, which flowers after, some species are there which flowers at 50 years, after 50 years, and some bamboo may flower after 100 years. After they flower, the plant dies. So this is the very unusual type of flowering. Okay, at the same time, there is another plant that you find it, that you call it as Nila Kuranji. Okay, Nilgiri Hills. The Nilgiri Hills has been given the name because the whole valley turns blue in color, and because of that, the local the flower you find in that region, you call it as Nila Kuranji, which is Strobilanthes kunthiana. It flowers after every 12 years. Okay, it flowers after every 12 years. After every 12 years only the flower, you will find the valley has covered with the flower. So this is the very unusual flowering. Similarly, in Himachal, Haryana, you will find Nag Pushpa. Okay, this flower also after 36 years it flowers. So like this type of, there are so many such type of plant which flowers after certain interval of time or years, and because of this flowering nature, you call it as unusual flowering phenomenon in some plants. Come to the next part, sexual reproduction in animals, events in sexual reproduction. So you see in biology, most of the students, what do? When they just see the sexual reproduction in animals, then they start writing it. But at the same time, you have to be very careful. You have to read the question very carefully. Here the topic is event in sexual reproduction. That means in sexual reproduction, what are the different types of event for any type of program? Okay, what are the event? One after the next, what is going to happen? So that you call it as event. Similarly, out here in a sexually reproducing organism, what are the different types of event that take place? So first of all, what do you have? Pre-fertilization event. That means for sexually reproducing organism, first of all, there has to be gametogenesis. That means the gametes should get formed. The reproductive cells should get formed. If it is in the case of human being, then you see that the male should be able to produce sperm, the female should be able to produce ovum. That is called as gametogenesis. The reproductive organs should be functional in nature. Okay. Then after that, these gametes needs to be transferred. Okay, so here you see that if it is in the case of female, then the female egg or ovum is immotile. Okay, that means it does not move. Whereas you will come across the sperm, it moves. That means there must be some type of way or by means by which this gametes needs to be transferred. That means there must be a copulatory organ. Okay, so we will be discussing about this gamete transfer in some other session. Number two event is fertilization or syngamy. Okay, so here when I say fertilization, the fusion of the two reproductive cells, okay, the male and the female reproductive cells, when they fuse together, fusing of these two reproductive haploid gametes is only called as what? Fertilization. You call it as syngamy. And there are two types of fertilization. One is called as external fertilization, another one you call it as internal fertilization. What do you mean by external? What do you mean by external fertilization? When the fertilization takes place externally outside the body. Okay, that means the male, they produce their reproductive cells outside in any medium. Okay, the female produce the reproductive cell outside the medium. That is, suppose say for example, if you are talking in terms of fish, toad, that means the medium is water. What do? They set their reproductive cells in the water at the same time. After that, these reproductive cells fuse together and forms into a zygote. What do you call this type of fertilization? You call it as external fertilization. Another one, internal fertilization. In the internal fertilization, what will happen? The reproductive cells fused together internally to the organism body. That means if it is in the case of human body, then you see that the fertilization takes place in the oviduct, in the fallopian tube, and especially if you want to come through the very confined point, that where does this fertilization takes place? It takes place in the ampulla. We'll be discussing in some other session. So anyway, any fertilization that is happening internally to the organism body, you use the term called as internal fertilization. Then after that, post-fertilization, after the fertilization has taken place, the two reproductive cell haploid gamete has fused together, leading to diploid nature. Then after that, what is going to happen? You see that the fusion of these two reproductive cells, you use the term called as zygote. Okay, that means reproductive cells, when they fuse together, it leads to the formation of zygote. And after the zygote gets formed, then mitotic division, like take for example, here, this is the reproductive cells of a male. Okay, this is the reproductive cells of a female. When this nucleus and this nucleus, N and N, then 2N. So this is haploid. This is also haploid. This one is diploid. So when the haploid gametes fuse together, it leads to diploid. This diploid, you call it as zygote. After this zygote, okay, it goes under mitotic division, and then after that, repeated mitotic division may lead to number of cells depending upon the type of organism, which leads to the formation of embryo. Finally, what will happen? This zygote will lead to the formation of embryo, and this embryo formation is only called as embryogenesis. the last part, that is partheno, the last part of this chapter. Okay, parthenogenesis, you also call it as virginal reproduction or virgin birth. Parthenogenesis is the development of an egg. That means the egg is formed or ovum into a offspring without fertilization. Here you see fertilization has taken place, zygote got formed, embryo got formed. Okay, but in this case any organism is formed without fertilization. That means a egg can get transformed into a offspring without undergoing fertilization. Such type of offspring formed are called as parthenogenesis. Again I repeat, parthenogenesis is the development of an egg or ovum into offspring. The egg or ovum is turning into an offspring without fertilization. The key word out here should be without fertilization. This is the very important, without fertilization. Okay, without fertilization is the key term, key word for writing this definition. Now, where do you often observe this type of parthenogenesis? Then you observe in rotifers. Okay, these are rotifers. When I say these are the microscopic organisms, zooplanktons. Okay, microscopic organisms are called as, okay, rotifers. Zooplankton. Example, zooplankton, phytoplankton. Okay, so it only takes place in zooplankton. Okay, rotifers. Aphids, you must have seen the plant louse. In some of the plant you will find a very tiny fly-like structure. Okay, those are called as aphids, honeybee and crustaceans. Okay, in this organism what type of reproduction takes place? It takes place by parthenogenesis. That means without fertilization it leads into a new organism. And some of the vertebrates, okay, some of the vertebrates like lizard, snake, certain birds, and even in some mammals, artificial parthenogenesis in mammals also reproduced by parthenogenesis. So when I talk about parthenogenesis, it means that the reproduction or any type of formation of offspring without fertilization is called as parthenogenesis. Okay, so this is all about in this chapter. In the next class where I'll come up with another chapter. Thank you.
Hello dear students, welcome back for the second episode of my online class for the subject Commerce for class 12. In the previous video, I explained the concept of business environment and the factors of microenvironment. So in today's class, I will be taking another topic from the same chapter business environment, that is macro environmental forces. So that is the topic for the day, macro environmental forces. So let's start. You know, micro-environmental forces or factors are concerned with specific organizations in the market. So they are related to a particular organization and they affect the performance and the function of that particular organization. However, there are other factors and forces which exert pressure from outside and affects the performance of not only one organization in the market, but all others in general. So these factors and forces from outside which affect the performance of all this organization in general, they come in the concept of macro environment. So the factors and forces of macro environment are social environment, political environment, economic environment, legal environment, and technological environment. So you can remember all these factors of macro environment by way of a single term or word, let's say SPELT, that is spelt. Okay, so that's how you can remember all these factors. So here the point to note down is, while carrying out the day-to-day activities, all these organizations, they do not interact with these forces regularly. Okay, so today we will be discussing about all these factors one by one. So from here, if you want to know what is meant by macro environment, then macro environment refers to those external forces which affect the working and the performance of all business enterprises in general or indirectly. Therefore, it is also known as indirect action environment, general environment, or remote environment. And these factors and forces of macro environment, they either create opportunities or they pose threats to the business organizations. So let us understand by way of example how these external forces, they create opportunities or they pose threats. Okay? Now, this pandemic COVID-19 and the lockdown decision taken by the government of many countries have badly affected the business and the whole economy of the world. Okay? So many organizations, be it in airlines, be it in travel and tourism, hotel and restaurant, school, colleges, all these organizations are badly hit. However, the current situation has given a new business opportunities to some of the business firms in the market. Okay? For example, the business of YouTube, TikTok have gone up because during this lockdown period, people have started creating and uploading their videos to their YouTube channels and their TikTok accounts. Likewise, the business of Zoom, okay, through its Zoom cloud meeting, Google through its Google Hangout, Google Meet, and Google Classroom, Microsoft with its Microsoft Team, Cisco WebEx, and many others, the business of these organizations have gone up in the market because they are, offering platform for online video conferencing, webinars, and even to take online classes. So this is a business opportunity for such organizations. So this way, any change in a macro environmental force may create opportunities and it may also pose threats to the organizations. So today, we will discuss about the 5 factors and forces of macro environment one by one. So let's start. The first component of macro environment here in my list is social environment. Social environment refers to the social settings, the norms within which the people live and they interact. It includes the social beliefs, customs, traditions, and culture. Since a business is a part of the society, therefore, all its actions and decisions should be in tune with the norms and the beliefs in the society. Now, let us understand some of the components of social environment. Number 1, demographic trends. It includes the size and the distribution of population in the society. It also includes, the age composition, the male-female ratio, the life expectancy of the people in the society, etc. The second component is social beliefs and customs. Social beliefs means the enduring perception of the people, and custom means the patterns of social interaction or engagement. Means how people take a particular thing and understand, and custom is related to the way people interact or behave in the society. Next component is social values. It includes fundamental rights, patriotism, the respect for human dignity, equality, relation, Next component is educational level. The educational level, it determines the knowledge of the people in the society and whether they are aware with their rights and duties or not. So for a business organization to be successful in the market or a society, it has to understand all these social norms and values. Okay, so it will help the organization to find out what to offer, how to offer, whom to offer, whether the products and services will have to be offered to children, okay, adults, youth, or elderly people, whether those products should be offered to male or female. So in that way, it helps to determine the market, segment. In this way, the knowledge of all these social norms and the beliefs in the society will help the company or the organization to find out what to offer, how to offer, whom to offer, and at what price to offer, depending upon the income level of the people living in the society. Okay? Moving on to next, we have political environment. Political environment refers to the political system and its working that influence the business operations. Basically, political environment consists of all the factors and forces concerning the administration of public affairs. And it includes, government at the local level, that is local government, state government, and also the central government. Okay? The components of our political environment are, number one, constitutional framework. It refers to the fundamental rights and duties conferred by the constitution of the country to the politicians. Next, political parties and their ideologies. A political ideology is set of principles, doctrines, and ideals which ultimately guide the function of that particular political party. Next, government system. It means the system of forming a government and its working. And it also includes government policies related to business and foreign companies. I believe the present government is stable, okay, and therefore the business organizations can carry out their activities smoothly when the political condition of a country or a place is stable. The present government at the center is trying to enhance the foreign investment by making the foreign policies slightly liberal. It is trying to attract foreign investment in the Indian economy, and it is also trying to encourage the domestic entrepreneur to start their business through Startup India by providing financial assistance. Therefore, the knowledge of all this political condition is very important for a business to understand how to go about within the current scenario of the politics or the political condition. Moving on to next, we have economic environment. Economic environment basically consists of all the factors and forces concerning, the means of production and distribution of wealth within a country. These factors and forces, they influence the purchasing practice of customers in the market, therefore affecting the demand, the supply, the price, the production, investment, and employment in the country. The factors and forces of economic environment, the components are economic system. The economic system of a country can be any of out of these three. It can be a capitalistic system where the factors of production and distribution will be controlled by the private firms and private individuals. Okay. The other one is a socialistic economic system, that is the planned market where the government will have more control on the factors of production and distribution, and the price will be set by the government. And the third one is the mixture of the two, that is the mixed economy or mixed environment. I mean to say the mixed economic system, where to some extent there will be government control on the factors of production and distribution, as well as the fixation of prices in the market. But at the same time, some factors or forces will be left to the free market forces to decide upon. Okay. Next, we have economic indices, and it includes the per capita income, the rate of growth, the rate of interest, inflation rate, tax rate, etc., prevailing in the market. Next, we have economic policies like industrial policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies, and even the 5-year plans of the government. Next component is industrial infrastructure, which includes the infrastructure for transportation, communication, and power supply. Okay? So the understanding of all these components of economic environment for an organization is very important, because these forces ultimately they lay down the foundation through which all the business activities can be carried out. Okay? Moving on to next, we have legal environment. Legal environment basically refers to the legal system or the framework of the rules, regulations, and laws in a country within which a business organization operates. So, the components of legal environment are rights and duties of citizen as specified in the Constitution. Next, laws concerning establishment, operation, and expansion of business. So, there are many legislations or laws passed by the government to regulate the activities of the different types of organizations, be it related to the establishment or to carry out the day-to-day activities, operations, the expansion, and even for the closer down or winding up of the business. To name few, we have Companies Act 1956, which is amended in 2013, which regulates and controls the functions of all joint stock companies. We also have Partnership Act 1932, which regulates the functions of partnership firm. We also have Factory Act, Trade Union Act, Industrial Dispute Act, Payment of Gratuity Act, and many more. Okay? Next, judicial system of the country. So basically, judicial system is to administer the enforcement of law and to give justice at the time of any dispute. Okay? So we have a district court, we have a high court at the state level, and we have Supreme Court at the national level. Okay? So from the consumer side, to protect the rights of the consumers, we have district forum, state commission, and national commission. Okay? Moving on to next, we have technological environment. So first of all, what is technology? Basically, a technology is the knowledge, tool, technique, and method that is used to transform material, information, and other inputs into finished goods and services. Okay? So ultimately, technological environment refers to the existing knowledge of science and technology and their application to carry out our day-to-day tasks or activities. You know, the incorporation of the latest technology to carry out our activities would be slightly costly because it requires investment. However, one investment will help the company to improve its efficiency, to reduce the cost, to improve the quality and the quantity of goods which are produced by the company, to reduce the per unit cost of production, and also to create a kind of image in the market. Okay? Therefore, as far as possible, every organization must try to incorporate new technologies or latest technologies to carry out their day-to-day activities to gain a competitive advantage in the market over the others. Okay? So, with this, I come to the end of today's session where I discuss about the 5 components or factors of macro environment, that is spelt, I mean to say social environment, political environment, economic environment, legal environment, and technological environment. So thanks for watching. In the next video, I will cover up the remaining 2 topics of the chapter business environment, that is importance of business environment and the SWOT analysis. Till then, stay home, stay safe, and keep learning. Thank you.
Welcome back, children, to these online classes, and especially welcome to the class where we will be dealing with literature in English. I had done 2 poems the previous week, the untouched poems in ISC, and today we will move on to the 3rd untouched poem in ISC, which is The Gift of India by Sarojini Naidu. Before we move on to the poem, first let me give you a brief background to the poetess Sarojini Naidu and also the reason behind writing this poem, because there is history behind this poem. Sarojini Naidu was not just a poet. She was one of the prominent freedom fighters during the British rule in India, and she was one of the frontline leaders of the Indian National Congress fighting for India's independence. That is why you will find in most of her poems a patriotic tone expressing her love for Mother India, her motherland, and there is also an Indianness in her poems. Those who are from ICSE background, you must have done the poem The Bangle Sellers. Previously, there was another poem in the ICSE syllabus, In the Bazaars of Hyderabad. In these 2 poems also, we see the Indianness expressed by Sarojini Naidu. Now I come to the background to the poem, why this poem was written. As I was telling you, that this poem was written when India was a colony of the Britishers. The Britishers were involved in the First World War from 1914 to 1918. In order to fight the First World War, the British Indian government had taken 1 million Indian soldiers to fight for them in this war. These Indian soldiers, these young men, were fighting in various battlefronts in various parts of Europe and Asia. Out of these 1 million Indian soldiers, nearly 75,000 of them died or were killed in the First World War. This poem basically deals with that incident. Now, how the matter is dealt with, if you have to understand that, you will first have to understand what kind of a poem is the gift of India. Like the dolphins, the gift of India is also a dramatic monologue. One is the speaker, and one or others are silent, passive listeners. That is why if you see type of poem, this poem is a dramatic monologue. Like the poem The Dolphins, in this poem, the poetess is speaking in the voice of Mother India. That means the speaker in the poem is Mother India. And she is addressing the Britishers. The Britishers are the silent, passive listeners. At that time, India was a colony of the British. As I have already told you, that she is addressing the British is clearly stated in the poem, though the British never speak in the poem. That is the speciality of a monologue. You have only one speaker, and other or others are passive listeners. Therefore, this poem is a monologue. Now, if you look at the poem, the 24 lines carefully, you will see basically the poem is divided into 3 parts. The poem begins with a question. The first 2 lines is a question. Mother India is asking the Britishers that had she ever held back or refused to give anything to the Britishers, be it clothes, food grains, or wealth. She had given everything to the Britishers as gifts. In reality, she had not given them as gifts willingly. Rather, everything was snatched away from her, looted and plundered, as she was a slave of the British. In the second part of the poem, Mother India is mourning, regretting, crying for the death of her 75,000 sons during the First World War. These sons of hers had laid down their lives, sacrificed themselves, fighting for the Britishers in various parts of the world, as I have already told you before. She also expresses pride in her sons who bravely fought and died. Without their sacrifice, the victory would not have been achieved. This is the second part of the poem. Now I come to the third part. In the third or the last part of the poem, Mother India is making an appeal to the Britishers or the then British government that when the war comes to an end, when the British government will be busy honoring the dead British soldiers, the sacrifice, contribution, and martyrdom of the dead Indian soldiers should not be forgotten. Their contribution should also be acknowledged by the Britishers. That will be some solace, some consolation and satisfaction for Mother India. That is how the poem is broadly divided into 3 parts. Now let us pick up the poem, and I will start with, obviously, the first part. You will notice the title of the poem, The Gift of India. And the poem begins with a question. Is there aught you need that my hands withhold, rich gifts of raiment or grain or gold? Mother India is saying, my dear Britishers, is there anything which India had and which Mother India had kept back or refused to give to the Britishers? In fact, Mother India never kept back or refused to give anything to the Britishers. She had given her clothes, she had given her food, she had given away her gold or wealth. Now, when you look at these 2 lines, the question, the beginning, there is a hidden irony. The point is, whatever Mother India had given to the Britishers, they were never given as gifts. Actually, they were taken away. They were snatched away. They were looted and plundered. They were taken away by force by the Britishers from Mother India. But Mother India, in a tone of kindness, generosity, magnanimity, says that she had given everything to the Britishers as if they were nothing but gifts. The irony is in the word gifts. Whatever Mother India had given were not gifts. They were not given away willingly. They were taken away, snatched, looted, plundered. And yet, Mother India is calling them gifts. Now see, that is what I have mentioned. In the first 2 lines, ought meaning anything, withhold means kept back. Now see, there are symbolisms in the words raiment, grain, and gold. Raiment literally means clothes, but symbolically it means honor and self-respect. Grain literally means food grains, but symbolically it means energy. And the last, gold, symbolically it means wealth. So, the Britishers had looted from Mother India her honor and self-respect. They had looted from her her energy, and they had looted from her her wealth. Though she says she had given away them as gifts, actually they were taken away from her by force. That is the beginning of the poem. Now let us move on to what Mother India is saying in reference to the 75,000 sons of hers who had lost their lives in the First World War. From now on, the tone of Mother India is that of sorrow, that of sadness, that of dejection. It's an aggrieved mother in a poignant tone, talking about the loss of so many of her sons. She says, "Lo, I have flung to the east and the west priceless treasures torn from my breast." Mother India is saying that, look here, my dear Britishers, I have offered, I have given, I have sacrificed 75,000 of my sons. They went to fight the First World War. They fought in various battlefields, be it in the East, be it in the West. And she is trying to say that her sons died during the war in various parts of the world, and she is mentioning some of them. One place is Ypres, which is in Belgium. Many died in Mesopotamia, and many had died at a place called Gallipoli. These are references to the East and the West. Priceless treasures torn from my breast. Who are these priceless treasures? This phrase is a metaphor. They stand for the 75,000 sons who are compared to invaluable possessions, precious assets for a mother. These priceless, invaluable gems, that is, the 75,000 sons were taken away, snatched away from Mother India, sent to various parts of the world to fight in the First World War. And most of them, many of them died either in Ypres in Belgium, in Mesopotamia, and in the battlefields at Gallipoli. And yielded the sons of my stricken womb to the drumbeats of the duty, the sabers of doom. She had to offer, she had to sacrifice her 75,000 sons. She had taken great pains as a mother to give them birth. But once they became young, the Britishers took them away, snatched them away from the mother, and sent them to fight in the First World War. They had to go there to the call of duty. Drumbeats refer to the call of duty. And they died there due to the various weapons used in the war. Sabers of doom, again, is a metaphor. It is a reference to the weapons of destruction used during the war. And due to these weapons of destruction, her 75,000 sons who had responded and gone to do their duty had to lay down their lives in various parts of the world. And the sad, sorrowful, aggrieved Mother India is mourning, feeling sorry for the death of her sons, who she had taken great pains to give birth and had taken great care to nurture them. Now we move on to the next part of the poem, lines 7 to 12. Gathered like pearls in their alien graves, silent they sleep by the Persian waves. In the beginning of this line, there is a simile. Gathered like pearls. Mother India had nurtured and taken care of her sons as if they were like pearls, precious gemstones. So she had taken care of these 75,000 sons. She had nurtured her sons as if they were like precious gemstones. But unfortunately, they died in foreign countries. They now lie dead in foreign graves. They are lying dead in graves near the Persian Sea. Now, you will see there are plenty of things to look at in these two lines, apart from its meaning. The meaning is simple. The sons of Mother India, who she had nurtured and taken care of like precious gemstones, are now dead. They are now lying dead, sleeping peacefully in foreign graves, some along the Persian Sea. But now let us see the figures of speech. See, silent they sleep. Obviously, repetition of the S sound, alliteration. But here you will have to understand, silent they sleep is also another figure of speech called euphemism. What is euphemism? Polite way of saying something harsh. Here it means they were dead. Like instead of saying he is dead, I can say it in a softer, politer manner. He has passed away. That is euphemism. Here, instead of the mother saying that they are dead in their graves, the mother is saying they are sleeping silently forever in their foreign graves. It's a softer way of saying that her sons are dead. Therefore, you have the figure of speech which is called euphemism. Now, by meaning near the Persian Sea. Are you clear? Understood? So remember, in these two lines, you have three figures of speech. Gathered like pearls, simile. Silent they sleep. First is alliteration, which is easy to understand. And the second here in this line is euphemism, meaning they are dead. Scattered like shells on Egyptian sands, they lie with pale brows and brave broken hands. Again, here we have a simile. Scattered like shells. S sound, therefore alliteration. But there is a comparison with the word like, therefore it is a simile. Now what is that simile? Simple. Her dead sons are scattered like shells on the sands of the Egyptian soil. Many of the Indian soldiers had died fighting in Egypt. Now see, pale brows. Who has pale brows? A dead body. That means her sons are sleeping in the graves with pale faces because they are dead. Again, Mother India does not use the word dead. She says pale brows. That is why, again, euphemism, a softer way of saying that they are dead. Broken hands. Obviously, many of her sons were maimed, wounded, disfigured before they died. And strewn like blossoms, I'll come to that. Now I come to the meaning. So, many of the dead bodies of our sons are scattered like shells on the sands of Egypt, and they are sleeping in their unknown graves with pale faces because they are dead. But before dying, they had fought bravely. They had given their best. They had shown courage. But despite all the bravery, fearlessness, and courage, they were maimed, wounded, disfigured, injured, and 75,000 of them had died. They are strewn like blossoms, mown down by chance on the blood-brown meadows of Flanders and France. Again, you will see in the first line, They are strewn like blossoms mown down by chance. There is a simile, a comparison. What is the comparison? Please pay careful attention. Just as a breeze scatters the petals of a flower, that means the flower dies, comes to an end because the petals are all scattered due to the breeze. Similarly, the First World War had scattered and killed her sons. When the petals are scattered, the flower dies. Here, the petals are the sons. Imagine this is a flower with many petals. Mother is holding the petals, therefore the flower is existing. Each petal is a son. Now, when a breeze would blow, the petals would break and scatter, and that would be the end of the flower. Similarly, when the breeze came, that is the First World War, the First World War took away from the mother the sons, the petals. They were scattered all over the world, and out of which 75,000 never came back. That is the simile, that is the comparison here. Now look at the word chance, mown down by chance. They were killed because it was written in their fate, it was written in their destiny that they had to die. Nobody could help it, the mother could not help it. And what has happened? The blood of the dead bodies of our sons are now mixed with the soil of many countries of Europe. That is what she is saying. See, many of these sons had died at a place called Flanders in Belgium and France. So, the brown soil of Flanders and France is now reddish because it is mixed with the blood of her sons. Now again, see, I told you, mown down by chance. Her sons were killed as it was written in their fate and destiny that they had to die. Blood brown meadows. Again, BB alliteration. But here is another figure of speech, juxtaposition, mixture, blood brown. Red and brown, these two colors are mixed because the brown color of the soil of Flanders and France is mixed with the red blood of her dead, martyred sons. That is what I have written. The brown soil of Flanders and France was mixed with the red blood of her dead, martyred sons. And as I told you, Flanders is in Belgium. Then you have Flanders and France, repetition of the F sound, therefore alliteration. Now, in the next lines, the poetess is directly addressing the Britishers, bringing out her sadness, her sorrow, her dejection, her helplessness. Can he measure the grief of the tears I weep, or compass the ooh of the watch I keep? Again a question. The poetess is asking the Britishers that, my dear Britishers, can you measure, can you calculate the amount of sadness and sorrow and grief that I have in my heart at the loss of my 75,000 sons? Can you imagine what copious tears I have shed in memory of my martyred sons? Or compass the ooh of the watch I keep? Can the Britishers ever comprehend? Can they ever understand how much care, how much love and affection, how much of these she had showered on her sons. She had nurtured them like precious gems, and now those gemstones have been snatched and taken away from her, never to come back. Or the pride that thrills through my heart's despair, and the hope that comforts the anguish of prayer. Now you will see in the first line I have just read out, there is some opposites put together. Or the pride that thrills through my heart's despair. See, the mother's heart is despaired. It is filled with sorrow and sadness at the death of her 75,000 sons. It is an irreparable, irreplaceable loss. But at the same time, her heart is also thrilling with pride. The pride of a mother that her sons had died fighting bravely, courageously. They have met with a brave, courageous, and fearless death in the various battlefields round the world. So you see, there is a mixture of two emotions: despair, sadness, sorrow, dejection at the loss of her sons, but at the same time, the pride of a mother at the courage and the bravery of her sons. The same thing continues in the next line. And the hope that comforts the anguish of prayer. Now let me come to this word hope. You know, anguish means pain. Obviously, a mother is always praying to God for her sons, for the goodwill of the sons, for the safety of the sons. But now she will pray with pain in her heart that may the souls of her dead sons rest in peace. But despite all these sadnesses and sorrows and despairs and dejections, there is a hope in her also. Now you must understand that this poem was written when India was a colony of the British. So as a freedom fighter, as a patriot, Sarojini Naidu is hoping that ultimately, the sacrifice and the martyrdom of her sons will not go in vain. Some result will accrue from their sacrifice. And what better hope can she have? Imagining, dreaming that these sacrifices will ultimately bring about the independence of India from the British. Are you clear? Okay. And the far sad, glorious vision I see of the torn red banners of victory. Again, in the first line, in the far sad, glorious vision I see of the torn red banners of victory, there are opposite emotions put together. I will come to the figures of speech. Look, what is the poet saying? And the far sad, glorious vision I see of the torn red banners of victory. Imagine, the First World War has come to an end. The Britishers are victorious. Obviously, the victory of the Britishers during the war was possible because of the sacrifices, the martyrdom, and the contribution of the Indian soldiers also. But 75,000 of them had died. So, the sadness in the heart of Mother India is the sadness of losing those sons. But there is a glory there also. The glory and the pride of a mother that this victory would not have been possible without the sacrifice of her sons. The same opposite emotions continue in the next line. Red banners of victory. See, when the Britishers will unfurl the flag of victory. It will be a moment of pride, not only for the Britishers, it will be a moment of pride for Mother India, because her sons also contributed to that triumph and victory. But at the same time, she will also feel sad that that flag of victory, that banner of victory was red, because it was mixed with the blood of her dead, martyred sons. That is why you should be very, very careful. Now let me come to the meanings. See, E is an old form of U. Here, a reference to the Britishers. Measure, I told you, calculate, imagine. Compass meaning calculate or understand. Woe meaning sorrow. Watch I keep, cared for her sons. Remember, obviously, how much care she had taken to nurture her sons. Now see, pride that thrills through my heart's despair. Mother India is proud of the bravery of her sons, which excites her heart. She is feeling proud of the bravery and the courage shown by her sons, but also fills it with sadness at their death. I told you, two emotions. Pride at their bravery, sadness at their death. Hope that comforts the anguish of prayer. The hope that it will bring India's independence. The hope that comforts the anguish of prayer. The hope that the sacrifice of our sons will not go in vain. It will bring India's independence. And she prays to God for this with pain of a mother in her heart. There is pain when she prays to God to rest the souls of her sons in peace in heaven. But the pain is also mixed with a sense of hope. The hope that these sacrifices will not go in vain, but ultimately bring about India's independence. Torn red banners of victory. Banners meaning flags. I told you, the flag of victory is joyful, but it is also red because it is mixed with the blood of her dead, martyred sons. In all these, so my dear students, in these lines you find the figure of speech oxymoron, where opposite words, thoughts or ideas have been put together. See, in this line, or the pride that thrills through my heart's despair, pride and despair, opposite. And the hope that comforts the anguish of prayer, hope and anguish. And the far sad glorious vision I see, sad and glorious, of the torn red banners of victory. Torn red banners mixed with blood, but that of victory. Opposite thoughts, words, ideas put together, and therefore you have the figure of speech oxymoron. Now we move on to the last part of the poem, which is actually the appeal of the poetess Sarojini Naidu to the British government. When the terror and the tumult of hate shall cease, and life be refashioned on anvils of peace. The poetess is saying, one day, the terror, the tumult, the chaos, the confusion, the deaths, and the destructions will finally come to an end. The First World War will come to an end. And when peace will return to this world, when the world will restart and refashion itself by leading a peaceful life, that time something has to be done for these dead Indian soldiers. Remember, an anvil is a solid raised iron platform used by a blacksmith to hammer and make the tools and whatever he has to make. The poet is trying to say that once the First World War will come to an end, the world will be hammered and refashioned and reshaped into a new world where there will be no death or destruction, fights or wars or battles, but there will be peace, love, affection, communication, cooperation. And once that peace returns to this world, she makes an appeal to the British government to do something. And your love shall offer memorial thanks to the comrades who fought on the dauntless ranks. Obviously, once the First World War comes to an end, once everything settles down to peace, the British government will become busy and eager to remember the contribution made by the dead British soldiers. They will start erecting memorials in honor of the dead British soldiers who fought so dauntlessly and fearlessly to bring about this victory. But Mother India is saying, and you honor the deeds of the dauntless ones, remember the blood of my martyred sons. Mother India is saying, my dear British government, when you become eager and busy to honor the dead British soldiers who contributed to this victory by fighting fearlessly and bravely, my dear government, please don't forget, please don't ignore the contribution made by my 75,000 sons. They died, they sacrificed their lives, they achieved martyrdom in order to contribute to your victory during the First World War. And therefore, along with the British soldiers, my sons also need to be honored. Their contribution needs to be acknowledged. That they were also a part of this victory needs to be accepted. Only if that is done, it will be some consolation, some solace, and some satisfaction for Mother India. Just see the figures of speech. Deeds of the dauntless. Repetition of the alphabet or consonant D, therefore alliteration. Okay, deeds refer to the brave efforts. Now I come to the theme of the poem. Through this poem, the poetess immortalizes the sacrifice of her sons. She pays tribute to their bravery and courage. She poignantly narrates her own sacrifices, how she is shocked, sad, sorrowful, heartbroken, and dejected, how she is aggrieved at the loss of her 75,000 sons. It is the cry, it is the lament of a mother, pained and anguished, whose only solace and consolation will be if the sacrifices of her sons are acknowledged by the Britishers or the British government. And as I told you in the beginning, Sarojini Naidu was a freedom fighter. And therefore, the poem also has a patriotic tone, expressing the poetess's deep love for her motherland and countrymen. So, when you conclude, you say that it is a poem where an aggrieved, sad, dejected, sorrowful mother, in a tone of appeal, is narrating how she had sacrificed 75,000 of her sons. But this sacrifice had not only brought in her sorrow and sadness. In fact, as a mother, she is also thrilled, excited, proud that their brave sacrifices, their martyrdom had contributed to the victory during the First World War. As a mother who is helpless and a slave, she wants nothing from the Britishers but an acknowledgement and acceptance that yes, her sons made a significant contribution to this victory or triumph in the First World War. That will be the greatest tribute that the Britishers could pay to her martyred sons. Thank you.